Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, I'm going to go on a bit of a rant. A rant about trends and herd mentality. But it's going to be about hair metal. And what happened after hair metal. I'm going to look at the trends in rock music that I clearly remember happening from the late 80s all the way to the mid 90s. I started getting into music in a serious way when I was like 13, 14. The year was 1987, and I was discovering music not from the era I was in, but from a previous era. I was into music from the 60s and the 70s. Now, at the time, I thought I was being original, but there was actually a whole hippie retro thing that was happening in the late 80s. And now my tastes over the next couple of years would start including the kind of punk alternative music of the underground, as well as metal of the more extreme kind. But my friends and I, we loathed the commercial music of the late 80s. And I hated most pop, R&B, and I especially despised what I now understand to be called electronic dance music, house, techno. And I still hate that music. But the rock in the mainstream in the late 80s was generally quite lame as well. And of course, nothing was lamer than hair metal. Now, I had a good friend of mine. He started getting into what were called the W bands. Warrant, White Lion, and Winger. I remember arguing with him about how cheesy and blatantly commercial this music was. Now, eventually he came around to my way of thinking, but we knew people who would fully embrace this music and would have, feathered hair and tight jeans. Now, the videos, they were all cliched and formulaic with bright lights, scantily clad women, spandex, big hair. Now, the style of music had quite a large female fan base, which was probably the motivation for many of the male fans to get into this music. And I remember witnessing this subculture firsthand when I saw Skid Row open for Aerosmith in January of 1990. Now, ironically, the band that was most successful out of this genre at the time was Guns N' Roses. And they definitely had more guts and less hairspray than the contemporaries. And I did quite like them at the beginning, and I still kind of do, but I remember getting turned off by the oversaturation of their presence, and it, kind of started to annoy me. And, my favorite music was always the stuff from the late 60s to the early 70s, and I always felt like the song by St. Vitus, Born Too Late, like I missed out on that rock and roll renaissance between like 1965 and 1975. But again, I was also discovering more underground music, and I remember in very early 1990, I saw an interview with Kim Thale of Soundgarden, who said that his band was both metal and rock, but also alternative and strange. Now, this was the kind of thing I'd been waiting for, and I started becoming more interested in underground music. And you could find interesting music reviews in places like Thrasher magazine, the skateboard magazine, and Alternative Press, and Spin even. But, the mainstream was still more interested in things like hair metal. You think about like Warrant's Cherry Pie, big hit around that time. And, there was another phenomenon that I knew. It was kind of connected to hair metal. These guys are like poodle hair guitar techs, whose job was to create the fastest arpeggio-laced guitar solo possible. They would, follow the bands that would be on the inside of the Guitar Player and Guitar World magazine, bands like Racer X and Cacophony, and these guys would worship at the altar of Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, and of course the mighty Yngwie Malmsteen. A shredding guitar solo was an essential part of any hair metal band too. And I remember arguing with many people why I'd rather hear a noisy Jimi Hendrix solo than any of those shredders. And I would meet people who played in bands and stated that you needed to play these kind of big commercial sounds and even wear spandex if you ever wanted to be popular. And in these rock bands, the production was getting bigger with producers like Bob Rock. And even, the mighty Metallica, they had toned down their sound with the Black Album. Not quite hair metal, but it was definitely not the offensive thrash metal that used to shock the mainstream. Hair metal was certainly what you had to do if you wanted to be successful in rock, tail end of the 80s and the cusp of the 90s. But oh boy, what a difference a year makes. Watching Nirvana rise up the charts in late 1991 and early 1992 was an interesting phenomenon, to say the least. A band that had a sound like many of the underground bands my friends and I started to like at that time. Things like Dinosaur Jr., now this band had started to become really popular. And there started being interest in the bands from Seattle, like of course Soundgarden, and other bands like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. They're really starting to permeate the mainstream. And then there was this band that appeared on the scene called Pearl Jam. And you know, as if it happened overnight, so many of those hair metal fans started to wear flannel, toques, Doc Martens. The hair metal genre kind of turned into like a turd that no one wanted to touch. Everyone wanted to disassociate themselves, and they were now kind of living in this present day and moment, and the past should never be mentioned. You know, and this was for a lot of people. Did you know that Rivers Cuomo, Weezer, was in a hair metal band? You know, once you get this new music, the past is obsolete. And those guitar shredders were now trying to create noisy music and imitate things like Rage Against the Machine. You know, I knew hair metal guys who by 1994 were playing math rock. And maybe this was a good thing. But you know, this phenomenon gave me a deeper understanding of how trends operate. People want to fit in and do not want to be left on the outside. When disco started to decline, I imagine everyone claimed, no, I always hated disco. Now, there was an argument that, you know, when grunge breaks through, having better music hitting the mainstream. And that was true, but it was kind of short-lived. You know, sure, there were some great underground bands like Soundgarden hitting the mainstream. But what would ultimately be is corporate bands that imitated those sounds and kind of sucked out the integrity of the music. You know, there was all these Pearl Jam imitators with the Jarl, you know, things like Stone Temple Pilots, and eventually it'd be Creed and Nickelback, you know, the pop punk of Green Day and Offspring, and then you get these bands like Third Eye Blind by the late 90s. This is just terrible. You know, hair metal, for all its flaws, at least it came out of some kind of a subculture and could trace its roots back to, you know, like Hanoi Rocks and even the New York Dolls. This mainstream alternative music of the mid to late 90s had zero culture. It was just blanket conformity. You know, anyone who was still trying to play hair metal in 1995 would have my respect. But, you know, the vast majority of people do not want to find themselves on the wrong team. You know, and was there a lot to criticize about hair metal? Yes, and I certainly did it at the time. But the fact that everyone dropped it when it became safe to do so bothered me more. This gave me a lot of insight on how people think and how trends operate. People want to be part of the trends generally, and they don't want to actually have to think for themselves. Anyway, that's the end of my rant. I am a fan of Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses. They aren't my favorite music, but I do kind of like them. I will say, I don't like any of those Pearl Jam imitators at all. So, these are just my opinion. Tell me what you think in the comments. And please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.